One of the key battle lines in the election is the Conservatives' pledge to hold a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union if they win or if they are in government. Depending on who you ask, Britain exiting the EU, or Brexit as it's known, would be the best thing that happened to the country in decades, or a disaster. A paper out this week outlines a worst-case scenario in which the UK leaves the European Union in 2018 and fails to strike a trade deal with the rest of the EU, as well as not pursuing a free trade agenda. That, the think tank Open Europe claims, would wipe 2.2% off GDP in 2030. For more, let's bring in Open Europe's Mats Persson, who joins us now. Mats, thanks very much for coming in. So just to clarify then, you range of outcomes that are from GDP falling by 2.2% to GDP going higher by 1.6%. So what do we conclude from that?
Well, we can conclude that, first of all, this is a more finely balanced calculation than what most previous studies have claimed. You hear all these very dramatic claims in both directions, that if Britain leaves the EU, it will become like North Korea, completely isolated, or on the other side of the argument, you have this idea that it will become like Hong Kong overnight, sort of this free trading heaven with the world at its feet. And what we're saying in this report is that, first of all, it probably will be somewhere between there, but secondly and crucially, Brexit, the outcome of Brexit, the effect of Brexit will very much depend on what happens in these negotiations following Britain's exit, and what Britain itself chooses to do with its sort of newfound economic freedom. If it goes for deregulation and free trade, well, it could potentially prosper, but if it resorts to protectionism and looking inwards, then, you know, it might actually be worse off.
The magnitude of those varying factors differ. In terms of the main factor that will determine success or failure here, what is it? If you were to put one at the top of the list?
I think the crucial thing that Britain has to do is to get some sort of deal with the rest of the European Union outside the EU, to get that kind of market access for British firms that it currently has, or at least come close to that type of market access. So, in concrete terms, British car manufacturers do not face a 10% extra cost when they're trying to export something to European consumers. Chemicals firms, that they don't face 45% extra costs when they export, or financial services companies, that they can continue somehow to access the European market. I think that is the key thing that has to happen after Britain leaves the EU.
And in terms of your analysis, do the relationships between Norway and Europe and Switzerland and Europe, do they help in analysing what a UK outside the EU look like?
I think they help in illustrating how difficult it actually is to negotiate a tailored deal for yourself outside the EU that works in all kinds of different ways. If you look at Norway, for example, Norway is effectively a member of what's known as the EU single market, the big trading zone. So they have to accept most of the regulations that the EU produces, but with no form of votes over those regulations. And why would Britain want to do that to itself? So Norway would not work. Switzerland is slightly better, but even there, it's not the type of market access that British firms would look for. And again, it does not involve as strong of a say over the rules governing that market access that British business would reasonably want to see. So Britain would probably have to negotiate a tailored deal, a new deal for itself. And that's what we're looking at in this report as well. And it won't be easy, that's the main thing. No matter how you look at it, leaving the EU will not be easy.
Leaving the EU won't be easy. How will it look from the other side of the table? If I was negotiating with Britain, how much would I need the UK economy, which potentially within the next 20 to 30 years could become the biggest economy within Europe? There are things that the EU needs from the UK as well as the UK needs from the EU.
I would say that post-Brexit, the UK will be in a reasonably strong position to negotiate that free trade deal that I just talked about. I mean, rightly mentioned, the UK is already basically the second largest economy in Europe, and may in a few decades' time be the largest economy. And why would Europe want to lose, or the European Union want to lose, its biggest potential growth at the time when the Eurozone is notoriously weak on demand, and very few people within the Eurozone is buying anything, so Britain is a big market there. So therefore Britain would have a quite strong negotiation position, but it also depends a bit on the sectors. I think it has a weaker negotiating position in financial services, where it sells a lot more to Europe than vice versa. And that's where I think the rest of the EU would have not so much incentive, perhaps, to play ball.
And you say that a lot depends on the way that Britain treats the rest of the world if it were to leave the European Union. How much more open would relationships be with the rest of the world? Where are they not open already?
Sure.
Because we're in Europe.
Sure.
In your view,
there are two aspects to that question. On the one hand, it's what is the potential, and the second question, I suppose, is what is the political reality. And I think, in terms of the potential, I think there is potential there to open up the markets, both in terms of going and strike trade deals with countries like China and India, where the EU does not have a trade deal at the moment. But it's also potential for Britain to open up its own market and lower tariffs, lower barriers to trade, which I think will benefit consumers here. Now the question, though, and this is what we look at in detail in our report, will the British politicians and voters embrace that kind of free trade deregulation model outside the EU? And that's far from clear.
Mats, thank you very much for joining us. Mats Persson, Director of Open Europe.